Now that we've looked at the structure of water in terms of the hydrogen being bound via covalent bonds to the oxygen, let's discuss the functions of water within the human body. There are 5 functions of water within the human body. The first, as a reactant. Water is often an active reactant or participant in chemical reactions. Water also helps with temperature control in the body. The number one way for that is through sweat. So when the body becomes too warm, you produce sweat, and then the heat from the body goes into evaporating the sweat, and it removes that heat from the body. Water plays a role in transportation. When we get to blood and lymph later on in the course, we'll see how water plays a role within both of those fluids in order to help to transport various things around the body. It also acts as a lubricant. When we discuss mucous membranes and serous membranes later in the course, we'll see that water is a major part of the fluid produced by those membranes that help to lubricate surfaces and so on to reduce friction and damage and things that we'll talk about at that point. Finally, water also acts as a solvent. Water acts as a solvent in the sense of that things can dissolve within water. The reason for this is that the water molecule with this structure kind of has some unique properties to it. As you can kind of tell here, the electrons within the water molecule are more on the left side or the oxygen side of the molecule. The protons, the nuclei from the hydrogen atoms, are sort of sticking off to the right-hand side, which means that we end up with an interesting setup for a water molecule where the right side or the hydrogen side is actually slightly positive because of those protons that are sort of sticking out on the side. With all the electrons over by the oxygen, we end up with a slightly negative side on the other side of water. What this allows for is that water is attracted to other water molecules because you have this slightly negative and slightly positive side, and as we can see here, the water molecules line up with each other, and this is part of the reason why the water ends up as a fluid and having the properties that it does. However, if we were to think about dissolving a solute in the solvent water, looking at the salt crystal of the sodium chloride that we saw earlier, we have this repeating structure to the salt crystal of sodium, chloride, sodium, each sodium surrounded by negative chloride ions, each chloride ion surrounded by positive sodium ions. And then, if we were to put that into water, as this image is showing here, we have the water with slightly positive and slightly negative sides. What will happen is the slightly positive sides to the water will be attracted to the chloride ions because they're negative. The slightly negative side of the water will be attracted to the positive sodium ions within the crystal. What we need to remember is that all of these particles are actively moving, unlike in our image that we're showing here. So as those water molecules bump up against the sodium chloride compound, what will happen is that they will actually bump into the ions, be attracted as we just discussed, and pull out the various ions, the sodium and the chloride ions, such that they separate out from each other. This is how the sodium chloride will ultimately dissolve into the water because the water pulls apart the various ions that make it up. This is the process of dissolving the sodium chloride. This is how water plays a major role in the body as a solvent, allowing things to dissolve in it, and then ultimately leading to chemical reactions being able to take place between the chemicals that are dissolved in it. So let's look at the significance of water in the human body. We have the function of water within the human body, but water is not just significant because of those functions, but in the sense of how much of the body it makes up. It is the most abundant compound in the body, and 2/3 of our body weight is actually due to water in our body. On average, a human has 40 liters of water within them. As we've said, water is a major component of our blood and other body fluids, and our survival ultimately depends on not having too much or too little water in our bodies. And so our body maintains homeostasis of our water levels because it's so important to our function and we have so much of it in our body, but we need to maintain the appropriate balance of it. So let's discuss the homeostatic amount of body water and its distribution. In the image here, we're looking at one single cell sitting in a representation of all of the water of our body that's outside of our cells. So, out of our total amount of body water, 63% is actually found intracellular. Intracellular meaning inside the cells that make up our body. So approximately 2/3 of our body water is found within cells. The other approximately 1/3 of our body water is found in extracellular fluid. These include all the fluids outside of our body. They're made up of things like transcellular fluid, so fluids that we'll look at in other units of the course, things such as cerebrospinal fluid, fluid found within eyes, our joints, glands, within lymph of our lymphatic system, within the plasma of our blood, as well as overall within tissues in our body that altogether are called interstitial fluid. Ultimately, our body does various processes that we will look at throughout this course in order to maintain this homeostatic amount of water. And related to the electrolytes that we discussed earlier in this unit, maintaining the appropriate balance of electrolytes dissolved both within the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid of the body. The relationship between water intake and output in the body directly relates with the homeostasis that we've been discussing. Our body, again, is made up of approximately 40 liters of water, and in order to maintain homeostasis of our body water, the amount that we take into our body and the amount that we get rid of from our body need to be equal to each other in order to maintain that homeostatic amount of water. In terms of maintaining this balance, we can identify the primary source of water intake and loss. In terms of intake, the number one source of intake is through drinking water. We also get a lot of water from the foods that we eat. As much as it might not seem like there's a lot of water there, the foods that we eat are made out of other living organisms often, and those other living organisms have a good amount of water to themselves as well. And then through metabolism, so the production of energy that we will get to in the next few units, those reactions within the body also produce a little bit of water. It's not a major amount relative to the previous two methods, but it is still a source of water in our bodies. What are the major sources of output in our body? The number one is through our kidneys, through production of urine. However, we also lose water through perspiration, as well as through stool. So these are the major sources of intake and loss of water in the body. However, we should also look and define the term insensible water loss. What we've discussed so far in terms of water loss are all things that you can actually sense or feel. So urine, or when you produce sweat, when working out, going for a run, and so on. However, insensible water loss also occurs through a number of methods. The first is again through our skin. But in this case, this is the type of sweat that we actually can't sense. In our regular everyday lives, when we're not working out and producing a large amount of sweat, our skin is still producing sweat, partially for lubrication of the skin and also for heat control of the body. And that sweat goes to our surface and then will evaporate or get into our clothes and so on, and we don't actually sense it. But we can lose a decent amount of water through this insensible water loss through our skin. Another type of insensible water loss is through our breath. If you've ever been like this person here, gone out on a cold day in the winter and taken a breath, and then when you breathe out, you actually see your breath. What this is actually from is from evaporation from our lungs. So our bodies are quite warm, and so within our lungs, we actually will have some water that is evaporated into the air that we're going to breathe out. But then when we breathe it out on that cold day, it actually goes out into the air and it's cold enough that it condenses that water back into very tiny water droplets, and we see the droplets as the breath like we see in the picture here. But that's not just happening during cold winter days. Every time you breathe, there is an amount of water that has evaporated into the air you're about to breathe out, and then when you breathe out, you will lose that water from your body into the air. This is another type of water loss that we don't tend to think of because, again, it's insensible. We can't actually feel it. But it's something that is important when we're looking to total the amount of water loss for a patient, that we're not just considering urine and we're not just considering sweating when we're doing something high intensity through sweat, but that these are other methods of water loss in the body. Overall, as we discussed before, So now that we've discussed water and water balance, let's describe ions in relation to electrolytes and how that relates ultimately to the water we're discussing. In our bodies, water is seldom in a pure state. It often has stuff dissolved in it. And we were discussing some of that earlier when we were talking about taking sodium chloride and dissolving it into water, where we have the water attracted to the individual ions and pulling them apart from the sodium chloride crystal. Earlier, we were saying within the crystal we have these sodium ions and chloride ions, and then when we discussed them being dissolved into the solution, we again referred to them as ions being separated out. But the correct terminology for that is actually electrolytes. This is something that's often confusing because it's almost two words for the same thing. We have ions within the crystal. Then if we dissolve the crystal within water and break the ions apart, we then call them electrolytes. It comes from a historical name where people who were first discovering electrolytes realized when they took sodium chloride and dissolved it in water, suddenly they could pass electricity through that water where they couldn't when the water was in its purest state. Not knowing what was going on as we do now, they called those particles that made up the sodium chloride electrolytes. Substances that do not dissociate in this way into individual ions are called non-electrolytes. Some of those non-electrolytes actually do dissolve in water. Things like glucose, sugar, will still separate from each other the individual molecules and they will dissolve in water. However, it is not due to being made up of electrolytes, as is the case in sodium chloride. Now that we've described ions in relation to electrolytes and made a connection between the terminology there, we can identify the primary route of electrolyte intake and loss in the body, just like we did for water. Just like for water, there's intake, how we get it into the body, and loss, how electrolytes get out of the body. The major sources of intake in the body are from the food that we eat, from water, because again, water is not usually in a pure form, so even the water that we get from taps, from bottles, have electrolytes dissolved in it. A secondary source of electrolytes are metabolic reactions that take place in the body. Our output is through perspiration into the environment, through exercise, and that insensible sweat that we discussed earlier, through stool, and through our kidneys within our urine. So now we want to identify the chemical composition of intra and extracellular fluid. The following is a graph that will reveal a little bit at a time here, where the purple bar for the graph is representing the extracellular fluid of the body, and then the blue is representing the intracellular fluid. So purple for outside of the cells, the blue for inside of the cells. For sodium, sodium is the major extracellular ion in the body. There's a little bit of it intracellularly, but most of it is found outside of the cells. Potassium is the opposite, with most of it being found inside the cells. Calcium is found mostly outside of our cells, though there's not nearly as much as you can see relative to the sodium and the potassium. Magnesium is a major intracellular ion. Chloride is a major extracellular anion. Bicarbonate is a major extracellular anion. Phosphate is a major intracellular anion. And then after that, most other ions that we might look at would be very low, as is the sulfate shown here. One thing I'll say here is don't worry about the exact numbers here, but having an idea of which are the major intra and extracellular ions within the body.